The alarm screamed through the command center as another defense station vanished from the tactical display in a burst of static and silence. Colonel Thrace slammed her fist against the console and watched the red markers spreading across the holographic map like a disease-consuming healthy tissue. Station 47 is gone, her tactical officer reported through the chaos of shouting voices and emergency klaxons that filled the operations room. The Valkorian Empire had stood for 12,000 years as one of the galaxy's supreme military powers, and now Thrace watched it crumble in real time across her screens. The Devourers had come from beyond the galactic rim 6 months ago, and nothing the combined fleets threw at them made any difference to their relentless advanced energy weapons that could crack planets, bounced harmlessly off their adaptive shielding, while kinetic bombardments were absorbed and somehow converted into fuel for the swarm's endless hunger. Thrace had commanded fleets in 3 major conflicts during her career, but she had never seen anything like this nightmare that refused to follow any logical pattern of warfare. "Get me a connection to the Galactic Council," she ordered, and her communications officer worked frantically at his station before shaking his head in defeat. "All channels to the council chambers are overloaded," he said with barely controlled panic in his voice that matched the fear Thrace felt gnawing at her composure. Another station died, and 3 colony worlds went dark on the display as the Eastay Devourers consumed everything in their path without pause or mercy. The ancient species of the galaxy had grown comfortable in their power, and now that comfort was being stripped away by an enemy that cared nothing for tradition or honor. Thrace forced herself to think beyond the immediate crisis and remember the diplomatic mission she had undertaken 5 years ago to a small, isolated world called Earth. The humans were newcomers to the galactic community, and most species treated them with barely concealed contempt for their primitive technology and violent history. She had been one of the few who actually bothered to study human culture during that visit, and what she found both fascinated and disturbed her in equal measure. Their entire history was an unbroken chain of warfare and conflict that made the galaxy's occasional skirmishes look like children's games in comparison. They had fought each other with sticks and stones, then metals and chemicals, and finally with weapons that could split atoms and end their entire world. The galactic species had evolved beyond such savagery, but humans carried it with them like a genetic memory they could never quite shake loose. Thrace remembered walking through a human military museum and seeing displays of weapons that ranged from crude clubs to thermonuclear warheads. Human Guide had explained each innovation in killing with a strange mixture of pride and shame that Thrace still could not fully understand. Most species developed space travel and then abandoned warfare as barbaric, but humans had done the opposite by taking their violence to the stars. The emergency meeting finally connected, and Thrace's screen filled with the faces of the Galactic Council members representing 43 species from across known space. They argued and debated while the galaxy burned, and Thrace listened to the same failed strategies being proposed over and over again. "We need to fall back to the core systems and regroup," the Arthean ambassador insisted, while others shouted him down with their own desperate plans. "Our weapons are useless," the Krillian representative said with the flat tone of someone who had already accepted defeat as inevitable. Thrace waited for a pause in the chaos, and then spoke with all the authority her rank and reputation could command. "There is one option we have not yet considered," she said, and the council members fell silent to hear what she had to say. "The humans," she continued, and immediately the chamber erupted in scoffs and dismissive gestures that made her jaw clench with frustration. "The primitives from Earth," the Valkorian High Command representative said, with contempt dripping from every word like poison. "They have barely mastered fusion drives, and you want to ask them for military assistance." Another voice added with mocking laughter. Thrace stood her ground and let them finish their displays of arrogance before speaking again with ice in her voice. Those primitives have spent their entire existence perfecting the art of killing," she said, and the chamber grew quiet at her tone. "While we built beautiful cities and elegant ships, they were building weapons that could end worlds and strategies that maximize death. They fight wars we cannot even imagine, and they do it with a creativity that borders on insanity." The council members shifted uncomfortably because none of them wanted to admit that humanity's violent nature might actually be an asset. "I have studied their military history," Thrace continued while pulling up data on the shared screens. "They have a concept called total war, where entire populations become weapons and nothing is held back or considered too extreme. They develop nuclear weapons and then actually used them on each other, which is something no sane species would ever consider." The images showed human conflicts from across their blood-soaked history, and the council members looked away from the carnage displayed. "We are losing this war," Thrace said with brutal honesty that cut through the denial filling the chamber. "Every hour brings the Devourers closer to the core worlds, and nothing we do slows them down or makes them hesitate." Another alert flashed across the tactical displays. "As 2 more systems fell to the advancing swarm, I am going to Earth," Thrace announced, and the council exploded in protests and objections that she ignored completely. "You can continue debating while the galaxy dies, or you can acknowledge that desperate times require desperate measures," the Valkorian High Command representative tried to order her to stand down, but Thrace had already made her decision. She cut the connection and turned to her crew with orders to prepare her personal cruiser for immediate departure. "Colonel, are you certain about this?" her executive officer asked quietly while the rest of the bridge crew pretended not to listen. Thrace looked at the tactical display one more time and watched the red tide of destruction spreading ever closer to everything she had sworn to protect. "No," she admitted with a bitter smile, "but I would rather take a chance on the violent primitives than watch our civilization end because we were too proud to ask for help." The cruiser launched within the hour, and Thrace set course for Earth, while behind her the galaxy's greatest military powers continued to fall before an enemy they could not comprehend or defeat. She spent the journey reviewing everything she knew about humanity and trying to prepare arguments that would convince them to join a war for species that had treated them like unwelcome guests. The humans were unpredictable and emotional in ways that made other species uncomfortable, but perhaps that was exactly what this war needed. As her ship entered the Sol system, Thrace saw Earth's orbital defenses and felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. Those primitive weapons might be the galaxy's last desperate chance for survival. The human orbital defense platform loomed ahead like a fortress, built by paranoid engineers who trusted nothing and prepared for everything. Colonel Thrace's cruiser docked without incident, and she was escorted through corridors lined with weapons systems that seemed excessive for a simple space station. 2 human soldiers in combat armor flanked her, and their weapons stayed ready in a way that suggested they expected threats from every direction. The briefing room was stark and functional, with none of the decorative elements that other species use to display their culture and achievements. 5 human officers sat waiting, and their faces showed curiosity mixed with suspicion that made Thrace's task even more difficult. Admiral Jang was the senior officer present, and his weathered face carried scars that spoke of combat experience rather than ceremonial service. "Colonel Thrace," he said without the formal pleasantries that usually began diplomatic meetings between species. "You requested this meeting as urgent, so we are listening." Thrace activated her holographic display and showed them the tactical situation with brutal honesty about how badly the war was going. The humans watched in silence as star systems disappeared and fleets were consumed by the devourer swarm that nothing could stop. "We need your help," Thrace said simply because there was no point in diplomatic dancing around the truth. General Morrison leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms with an expression that could have been carved from stone. "You need our help," he repeated with emphasis on the word that made it clear how ironic he found the situation. The same galactic community that has spent 50 years treating us like dangerous children now wants us to fight their war. Thrace felt her face flush, but she forced herself to remain calm and acknowledge the truth in his words. Yes, she said without attempting to defend the indefensible behavior of the Council Admiral. Zhang pulled up a data file and began reading from what was clearly a prepared list of grievances. Trade restrictions that prevent us from accessing advanced manufacturing techniques, technology sharing agreements that only flow one direction away from Earth, exclusion from military planning committees because we are too aggressive, quotas on how many ships we can build because other species fear our expansion. Each item on the list was another reminder of how the galaxy had marginalized humanity out of fear and prejudice. The Arthian ambassador once told me that humans were too violent to be trusted with real power. General Morrison added, "Now you want us to use that violence to save species that look down on us." Commander Chun spoke up from her position at the end of the table, with anger barely controlled in her voice. "My cousin applied to the Galactic Military Academy 3 times and was rejected each time, despite perfect scores. The official reason was that humans lack the proper temperament for advanced tactical training." Thrace wanted to argue, but she had no defense for the systematic discrimination that humanity had endured since first contact. "You were right," she said, and the admission seemed to surprise the human officers more than any argument could have. "The galaxy has treated Earth with arrogance and fear instead of the respect you deserve. We looked at your history and saw only violence, without understanding the context or the progress you have made." Admiral Zhang studied her face as if searching for deception or manipulation behind her words. "Why should we care if the galaxy burns?" he asked with the bluntness that humans seem to prefer over diplomatic language. "Our world is far from the conflict zone, and we have time to build defenses before the devourers reach our space." Thrace had anticipated this question during her journey, and she knew the answer had to appeal to something deeper than logic, because that is not who humans are. She said while meeting the Admiral's gaze without flinching, "I have studied your history, and yes, it is filled with war and violence and terrible weapons, but it is also filled with stories of people who stood between the innocent and danger, even when they had no obligation to do so. You have a phrase about standing in the gap, and I think that describes humanity better than any other words." Commander Chen looked skeptical, but something in her expression suggested the words had struck a chord. "That is a nice speech," General Morrison said without warmth. "But speeches do not bring back the dead when our soldiers start dying for species that despise us." Thrace nodded because she could not deny the cost that humanity would pay. "If you help us, I will personally sponsor Earth's immediate ascension to full council membership with all rights and privileges. You will have complete access to the galactic technology databases without restrictions. Human officers will be integrated into command structures at all levels." Admiral Zhao and the other officers exchanged glances that suggested they were communicating through some means Thrace could not detect. "We need to discuss this among ourselves," Zhang said, and Thrace was escorted to a waiting room while the humans debated. She sat alone for 3 hours, wondering if she had failed and the galaxy would fall because of pride on both sides. When the door finally opened, Admiral Zhang's expression was unreadable. "We have conditions," he said, and Thrace felt hope flare despite her attempts to stay professional. "Full council membership effective immediately, not after the war. Complete technology transfer with no restrictions or delays. Human casualties will be honored equally with all other species, and Earth retains final authority over deployment of our forces." The conditions were harsh, but Thrace had no room to negotiate and no desire to deny humanity what they should have been given decades ago. "Agreed," she said, and shook the Admiral's hand in the human custom she had learned during her previous visit. "How soon can your fleets deploy?" she asked while already dreading the answer. "The first expeditionary fleet will be ready in 72 hours. Admiral Jiang said with the confidence of someone who had already begun preparations. Thrace felt surprise at the speed, but then realized the humans must have started mobilizing the moment they learned of the crisis. "I want to observe your military preparations," she said, because she needed to understand what kind of force humanity would bring. General Morrison smiled for the first time, and it was not a comforting expression. "Follow me," he said, and led her through corridors deep into the station's military section. The armory made Thrace stop and stare at weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum of primitive warfare. "These are kinetic rifles," Morrison explained while gesturing at racks of brutal-looking guns. "We also have plasma weapons and particle beams, but sometimes the old ways work best." They passed storage bays filled with missiles marked with warning symbols that made Thrace's blood run cold. "Nuclear warheads," she said with shock that she could not hide. "Those are banned by 17 different galactic treaties." Morrison shrugged with complete indifference to treaties made by species that were losing their war. "Earth never signed those treaties because we were not allowed to participate in the negotiations." The tour continued through facilities that produced weapons at a rate that seemed insane for a species supposedly restricted from military buildup. Thrace saw training simulations that made her stomach turn with their casual acceptance of massive casualties as acceptable outcomes. "You plan for your soldiers to die," she said while watching a simulation where an entire battalion was sacrificed to achieve an objective. "We plan to win," Commander Chan corrected her. "Sometimes winning costs lives, and we accept that cost because the alternative is worse." Thrace left the station that evening with authorization codes for the human fleet and a growing sense of dread about what she had unleashed. The galaxy had asked for humanity's help, but she wondered if they truly understood what that meant. As her cruiser departed, she watched the human fleet assembling in orbit and saw ships that looked more like weapons platforms than elegant vessels. They were ugly and brutal and covered in armor that suggested humans expected to take damage and keep fighting. Galactic Council had sneered at human primitiveness for 50 years now. Those primitives were coming to save them, and Thrace prayed the galaxy could handle what it had asked for. The rally point near the Corvin Nebula had never seen so many ships gathered in one location. Fleets from 40 species floated in formation, and their elegant vessels represented thousands of years of refined engineering and aesthetic design. Then the human fleet arrived, and the entire gathering fell silent. Colonel Thrace watched from her command ship as humanity's first expeditionary fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that looked more like a mob than a proper military arrangement. The human vessels were blocky and industrial, with none of the flowing lines that characterize proper warship design. Every surface bristled with weapons that ranged from massive railguns to missile pods to point defense systems that covered every angle. They looked like flying fortresses. Her tactical officer said with undisguised shock at the brutal functionality. Admiral Jiang's flagship was a monster of a ship called the Indomitable, and it made the Volcorian dreadnoughts look delicate by comparison. Thrace opened a communication channel to the human admiral, and his face appeared on her screen with a slight smile. "We are ready to begin operations," Jiang said, as if they were discussing a routine patrol instead of a desperate war for survival. The joint fleet meeting brought together commanders from dozens of species, and the tension was immediate when the humans entered. They wore simple combat uniforms instead of ceremonial dress, and their weapons stayed within arm's reach, even in supposedly secure areas. The Arthean fleet commander Civic looked at Admiral Jiang with barely concealed contempt. "Your ships appear to have been designed by engineers with no concept of efficiency or grace," Civic said, with the arrogance that had made his species insufferable. Smiled politely and gestured at the tactical display showing the Devourer advance. My ships were designed by engineers who understand that in war, there is no second place. The first engagement came sooner than expected when scouts detected a Devourer formation consuming a mining colony in the Tertius system. The combined fleet moved to intercept, and Thrace watched as formations organized according to traditional galactic battle doctrine. Ships spread into elegant patterns designed to maximize firing arcs while minimizing exposure to enemy weapons. The human fleet ignored all formation protocols and instead arranged themselves into a blunt wedge aimed directly at the enemy. Admiral Jan, "You are out of position," Commander Sivek transmitted with irritation sharp in his voice. "Negative," Jang replied calmly. "We are exactly where we need to be." The battle began when the leading galactic ships opened fire with particle beams and plasma torpedoes that lit up space with brilliant colors. The Devourer ships absorbed the energy through their adaptive shielding and returned fire with organic weapons that tore through shields like paper. 3 cruisers from the Valkorian fleet died in the first exchange, and panic began spreading through the command channels. Then the human fleet opened fire, and Thrace understood why their ships looked so different. Railguns hurled solid projectiles at incredible velocities, and the kinetic impacts bypassed energy shields completely. Missiles shrieked across space and detonated with nuclear fury that the Devourers had no defense against. A human destroyer took a direct hit that would have destroyed any other ship, but it kept fighting with half its hull missing and fires burning in exposed sections. All ships pull back to defensive positions, Sivek ordered while his formation collapsed under the Devourer assault. The human fleet ignored the order and accelerated forward into the teeth of the enemy. Formation Thrace watched in horror as a human frigate lost power and began drifting toward a Devourer battleship. Instead of abandoning ship, the crew used maneuvering thrusters to aim their dying vessel directly at the enemy. The collision tore both ships apart in a fireball that consumed everything within a kilometer radius. Did they just use their ship as a battering ram? Thrace's tactical officer asked with shock rendering his voice. Barely audible. More human ships pushed forward, and their point defense systems created a wall of fire that destroyed incoming projectiles. A Devourer cruiser adapted its shielding to deflect the kinetic rounds, and Admiral Jang's response was immediate. Target that ship with conventional explosives, he ordered, and dozens of missiles loaded with chemical warheads slammed into the Devourer. The cruiser's adaptive systems tried to compensate, but the humans switched back to railguns before the adaptation completed. The ship died in a cascade of secondary explosions that lit up the battle. Space Thrace realized she was watching a completely different kind of warfare than anything the galaxy practiced. Human ships worked in packs like predators, and they sacrificed individual vessels to create openings for killing blows. They used weapons that ranged from advanced particle beams to what appeared to be simple chemical explosives. The monsters unpredictability made it impossible for the Devourer adaptation systems to keep up with the constantly changing threats. A wing of human fighters swarmed a Devourer battleship, and several were destroyed by point defense fire. The survivors didn't retreat, but instead accelerated to ramming speed with their reactors overloading. The impacts were minor, but they created gaps in the battleship's defenses that allowed a destroyer to deliver a nuclear torpedo directly into its core. The ship tore itself apart from the inside, and debris rained across the battlefield. The humans fight like madmen, Commander Sivek said, and Thrace could not tell if his tone carried admiration or horror. The battle raged for 6 hours, and the Devourers began to retreat for the first time since the war began. Human casualties were horrific, with 15 ships destroyed and another 20 damaged beyond immediate repair, but the Devourer formation was shattered, and the mining colony was saved, though nothing remained of it, except radioactive debris. Thrace's ship docked with the Indomitable after the battle, and she found Admiral Jang in his command center reviewing casualty reports. His Face showed no emotion as he read the names of the dead and moved on to damage assessments. You lost nearly a quarter of your fleet. Thrace said because someone needed to acknowledge the cost. Jang looked up, and his eyes showed the weight of command that came with sending people to die. War has a price, he said simply. We knew that when we came. Thrace wanted to argue that such losses were unsustainable, but she had seen human manufacturing capabilities. They could replace ships faster than any other species, and they seemed to have an endless supply of volunteers willing to crew them. Your tactics are unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen, she said while pulling up recordings of the battle. You use your ships as weapons and your crew as ammunition. Jang stood and walked to the viewport, where repair crews worked to patch the Indomitable's damaged hull. We learned a long time ago that being willing to sacrifice everything is sometimes the only way to win. Other species fight to minimize losses and preserve their forces. Humans fight to win regardless of what it costs us. He turned back to Thrace, and his expression was harder than any metal. You asked for our help, and this is what human help looks like. We will throw ourselves into the fire if that is what it takes to stop the Devourers. Thrace felt cold, despite the comfortable temperature in the command center. The galaxy had asked humanity to fight, but she wondered if they understood what they had truly asked for over the next 3 weeks. The human fleet led a campaign that pushed the Devourers back system by system. Each victory came at a terrible cost in human lives, but the advance never stopped. Other species began to understand that humanity fought with a determination that bordered on fanatical. They watched human marines board Devourer ships in close combat that was brutal and savage beyond anything seen in modern warfare. They saw human pilots deliberately crash their fighters into enemy vessels when they ran out of ammunition. They witnessed human ground forces hold positions long after any sane commander would have ordered retreat. The Galactic Council received reports that describe human tactics with words like reckless and suicidal and devastatingly effective. Admiral Jang never apologized for the methods his forces used, and he never hesitated when opportunities required sacrifice. Began to understand that humanity had brought more than just weapons and ships to this war. Had brought a willingness to pay prices that no other species could accept. The question was whether the galaxy could handle the implications of what that truly meant. The war had been raging for 3 months, and the human casualties had reached numbers that made the Galactic Council uncomfortable. Colonel Thrace received daily reports listing the dead, and each transmission added more weight to the burden she carried. The combined fleet had pushed deep into territory controlled by the Devourers, and every kilometer of space was purchased with blood and sacrifice. Admiral Jang called a command meeting, and Thrace attended along with senior officers from a dozen different species. Intelligence suggests the main Devourer hive complex is located in the Calthra system. Jang began while the tactical display showed a star system bristling with enemy ships. If we can destroy the hive, we can cripple their ability to adapt and coordinate. Commander Civic studied the display, and his face showed the same conclusion. Everyone reached immediately. That system is a fortress, he said with resignation already creeping into his voice. We would lose half our fleet trying to breach those defenses. Admiral Jang nodded without emotion and highlighted a route through the defensive perimeter. The human Second Fleet will create a breach here by drawing the majority of enemy forces. The combined strike force will then push through and deliver a payload directly to the hive structure. Thrace felt her blood run cold when she realized what Jang was proposing. The Second Fleet will be destroyed, she said, and Jang met her eyes without flinching. Yes, he agreed simply, but they will buy enough time for the strike force to complete the mission. The other species representatives began arguing immediately about the ethics of such a sacrifice. Humans sat quietly and waited for the debate to exhaust itself before speaking. General Morrison stood, and his scarred face showed a lifetime of difficult decisions. Every member of the Second Fleet volunteered for this mission. He said with a tone that ended all argument, "They understand the cost and they accept it." The mission launched 2 days later, and Thrace requested permission to embed with a human marine unit for the boarding action. Jang approved the request and assigned her to Captain Rodriguez's company aboard the assault carrier. Thermopylae, the Marines were young, and their faces showed a mixture of fear and determination that Thrace recognized from countless battles. Rodriguez briefed his troops in a cargo bay that had been converted into a staging area. "Our job is to board the hive ship and plant charges that will allow the main payload to penetrate to the core," he explained while holographic displays showed the ship's layout. "Enemy resistance will be heavy, and we should expect casualties." One of the Marines raised his hand, and Rodriguez nodded for him to speak. "Sir, what are our extraction plans?" The young man asked. Rodriguez paused before answering, and his honesty was brutal. "There are no extraction plans," he said flatly. "This is a one-way trip." The cargo bay fell silent, and Thrace waited for protests or panic that never came. Instead, the Marines checked their weapons and prepared their gear with calm efficiency. "Why do they accept this?" Thrace asked Rodriguez quietly while the troops loaded onto assault shuttles. The captain looked at his Marines with something that might have been pride or grief. "Because someone has to," he said. "And because if we don't, then everyone dies, including Earth." The assault began when the Second Fleet crashed into the Devourer defensive perimeter like a hammer against glass. Human ships died in dozens, but they created the opening that the strike force needed. Thrace's shuttle screamed through space toward the hive ship, while point defense fire created a web of death around them. 2 shuttles exploded before they reached the hull, but Rodriguez's made it through, and magnetic clamps locked them to the organic surface. The Marines cut through the hull with plasma torches and poured into the ship with weapons. Blazing the interior was a nightmare of organic corridors, and the Devourers met them with creatures that seemed designed purely for killing. Thrace fired her weapon alongside the Marines and watched them fight with a ferocity that matched their enemies. A young Marine named Chum took a hit that burned through his armor, but he kept fighting until his squad could advance. Rodriguez pulled Thrace behind cover as a wave of Devourer warriors charged their position. The Marines held the line with grenades and automatic fire that turned the corridor into a killing field. "Move, move, move," Rodriguez shouted, and the survivors pushed deeper into the ship. They lost half their number in the first 15 minutes, and the pace never slowed. Thrace saw a Marine use his body to shield a wounded comrade from enemy fire. She watched another deliberately draw enemy attention so his squad could flank the position. The charges were planted deep in the hive structure, and Rodriguez activated the detonation sequence. "Strike force, this is Rodriguez," he transmitted. "Charges are active and we are pulling back to extraction." The response came from Admiral Jang himself, and his voice carried a weight that Thrace had never heard before. "Negative on extraction." Jang said, "The window is closing, and we cannot risk the mission." Rodriguez looked at his remaining Marines, and every face showed they had expected this outcome. "Understood, sir," he said without hesitation. "It has been an honor." The strike force's main weapon was a biological virus that human scientists had designed to attack the Devourer adaptation systems. Required delivery directly into the hive core, and the Marines who carried it knew they would die in the deployment. Thrace watched Rodriguez lead his troops toward the core chamber, and she followed because someone needed to witness what was about to happen. Final chamber was vast and filled with organic machinery that pulsed with alien life. Devourer defenders swarmed from every direction, and the Marines formed a circle around the virus deployment team. "For Earth," Rodriguez shouted, and his troops echoed the battle cry. They fought with everything they had, and when ammunition ran out, They used knives and bare hands. Thrace saw a Marine tackle a Devour warrior and detonate a grenade that killed them both. The virus was deployed and began spreading through the hive systems. Like fire through dry grass, the Devourers screamed with voices that should not exist, and their movements became erratic. Rodriguez was hit 3 times, but he kept firing until his weapon clicked empty. He looked at Thrace and smiled despite the blood running down his face. "Get out of here, Colonel," he said while reloading his last magazine. "Tell them we did our job." Thrace wanted to argue, but she knew the mission required someone to report what happened. She ran toward the breach point, while behind her, the Marines made their final stand. The shuttle pulled away from the hive ship as it began tearing itself apart from the virus spreading through its systems. Thrace watched through the viewport as the massive structure collapsed and took the remaining Marines with it. The second fleet was gone and the boarding teams were dead, but the mission had succeeded. The virus spread through the Devourer network, and their adaptation systems began failing across every front. The tide of the war shifted as human scientists refined the weapon and deployed it to other hive clusters back on the Indomitable. Thrace attended a memorial service for the fallen and saw thousands of names. Scrolling past on displays, Admiral Jang stood before the assembled crews, and his voice carried to every ship in the fleet. "We honor those who gave everything so that others might live," he said, with emotion breaking through his usual composure. "They knew the cost, and they paid it without hesitation, because that is what humans do." Thrace finally understood what acceptable losses meant to humanity. It was not that the losses were acceptable, but that humans would accept any cost to protect others. The galaxy had asked for their help, and humanity had answered with blood and sacrifice as the memorial ended. Thrace wondered if the other species truly understood the debt they now owed, and she wondered if they could ever repay it. The final Devour hive cluster collapsed 6 weeks after the virus deployment, and with it died the last. Organized resistance scattered. Remnants of the swarm fled toward the galactic rim, and pursuit fleets hunted them down one by one. The war was over, but the cost had been devastating beyond anything the galaxy had previously experienced. Colonel Thrace stood on the observation deck of the Galactic Council Station and watched the victory celebrations happening across 100 worlds. But her mind kept returning to the names of the dead, scrolling endlessly through memorial databases. The human casualty list contained over 300,000 names, representing soldiers and crew who would never return home. Earth itself had declared a month of mourning, and their celebration was quieter than the joy displayed by species that had lost far. Fewer. Admiral Jang arrived for the formal council ceremony, wearing his dress uniform with medals that seemed inadequate to describe what he had accomplished. "Are you ready for this?" Thrace asked while they waited in the anteroom. Jang smiled with exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Ready to be celebrated by people who 3 months ago thought we were too primitive to matter," he said. "Not particularly, but it comes with the job." The council chamber was filled with representatives from every species, and the atmosphere carried a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Thrace took the podium first, and the room fell silent to hear what the Valkorian officer who had brought humanity into the war would say. 6 months ago, I stood before this council and suggested we ask Earth for military assistance," she began, while her voice echoed through the chamber. "Most of you dismissed the idea as desperate foolishness from a species you considered primitive and violent." Some of the representatives shifted uncomfortably, but Thrace continued without softening her words. "You were right about humanity being violent," she said, and paused to let that sink in. "But you failed to understand that violence wielded with purpose and sacrifice is sometimes exactly what survival requires." She pulled up images from the war showing human ships ramming enemy vessels and Marines fighting in impossible situations. Humanity threw itself into the fire to save a galaxy that had treated them with contempt. They lost 300,000 souls fighting for species that would not even let them join your military academies. And they did it without hesitation, because that is who humans are. The chamber remained silent, and Thrace could see shame on many faces. This council owes Earth a debt that can never truly be repaid, she said with finality. But we can start by granting them the respect and equality they should have been given from the beginning. Admiral Jang took the podium next, and his speech was characteristically brief. Earth accepts the Council's offer of full membership, and we look forward to working with all species as equals. He said, "We fought this war not for glory or recognition, but because it needed to be done. Our people understand sacrifice, and we hope the galaxy will remember that when peace makes war seem distant and unnecessary." The formal ascension ceremony followed, and Earth was granted every right and privilege that came within her. Council membership, human officers were integrated into command structures, and technology sharing became unrestricted in both directions. But Thrace noticed how other species now looked at humans with something beyond gratitude. They saw the brutal efficiency of human warfare and understood that Earth was now a major power with military capabilities that exceeded most species. The celebration banquet was elaborate, but Thrace found Admiral Jang standing alone on a balcony overlooking the station's garden section. "You should be inside accepting congratulations," she said while joining him. Jang shrugged and continued staring at the artificial trees. "I keep thinking about Rodriguez and his Marines," he said quietly. "They died so we could have this victory, and now politicians make speeches about honor and sacrifice. But those words feel empty compared to what those people actually did." Thrace had no response because she felt the same hollow sensation. They had won the war, but the cost was written in names that would be remembered long after the celebrations ended. "Do you regret coming when I asked?" she finally said. Jang considered the question while lights from the celebration reflected off the garden's water features. "No," he said after a long pause. "Someone had to stop the Devourers, and we were equipped to do it. But I wonder if the galaxy truly understands what they have created by bringing us into their community as equals." Thrace understood his meaning immediately. The galaxy had seen human warfare, and now they could never view Earth as harmless again. "They fear you," she said, and Jang nodded. "Yes, and maybe that is necessary," he replied. "Fear can prevent future conflicts if it reminds people that war carries costs they might not be willing to pay." The conversation was interrupted by General Morrison, who appeared with urgent news. "Admiral, we have received reports from the frontier," he said, with tension evident in his posture. "Some of the council members are already proposing restrictions on human fleet expansion." Jang's jaw tightened, but he showed no surprise. "Of course they are," he said bitterly. "We saved them, but now they want to make sure we cannot become a threat." Thrace felt anger rising because she had hoped the galaxy would be better than this. "I will speak against any such proposals," she promised. Morrison shook his head with a knowing expression. "Respectfully, Colonel, it will not matter," he said. "The galaxy sees us clearly now, and they understand we are dangerous. They will smile and thank us while working to limit our power." Jang placed a hand on Morrison's shoulder. "Let them try," he said with quiet confidence. "We proved ourselves in this war, and Earth will never go back to being second-class citizens. If they want to fear us, then we will show them that earning our friendship is far better than making us enemies." The three of them returned to the celebration, but the mood had shifted from joy to something more. Complex. Earth had saved the galaxy, but in doing so they had revealed capabilities that made other species nervous. In the weeks that followed, human ships departed for home carrying the remains of the fallen and stories of impossible victories. Thrace requested a final visit to Earth before returning to her own duties. She traveled to the military cemetery where Captain Rodriguez and his Marines were being laid to rest. Thousands of graves stretched across a hillside, and each marker represented a sacrifice made for species that most of these soldiers had never met. Admiral Jang stood among the mourners, and his presence drew no special attention from the families gathered there. Thrace joined him, and together they watched as the burial details performed their solemn duty. "How can you accept these losses?" she asked, because she still could not comprehend the human capacity for sacrifice. Jang was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because if we do not, who will?" he finally said. "We learned long ago that someone has to stand between the darkness and those who cannot fight. That is just what humans do." A young girl approached with flowers and placed them on a fresh grave. Her father had died during the assault on the hive cluster, and she would grow up without him, but she stood straight and saluted the grave with precision that spoke of military tradition. Jang returned the salute, and the girl walked away with her mother, who carried the same quiet dignity. "I understand," Thrace said with wonder. "Even the children understand what was sacrificed and why." Jang nodded slowly. "Yes, and that is both humanity's greatest strength and our deepest tragedy. We teach our children that some things are worth dying for." They remained at the cemetery until the last burial was complete, and evening shadows stretched across the hillside. Thrace prepared to depart, Earth knowing she would carry the memory of this place forever. As her shuttle lifted toward orbit, she looked down at the planet that had saved the galaxy. The humans had answered when called, and they had paid prices no other species would accept. The galaxy owed them everything, but Thrace suspected humanity would never demand payment. They had fought because it needed to be done, and that was reason enough. Back on her ship, Thrace made a personal log entry that would be sealed for 50 years. "We asked the humans for aid, and they answered beyond anything we deserved or expected." She recorded, "They saved us with violence and sacrifice that will haunt my dreams. The galaxy must learn to coexist with a species that understands war on levels we cannot match. We should be grateful they fight for us, but we should also pray we never give them reason to fight against us, because I have seen what humanity can do when they decide something must be stopped, and I know the galaxy could not survive if Earth ever became an enemy instead of an ally." She closed the recording and set course for Valkyria. Ben Hur Earth continued its mourning, while also beginning the reconstruction of fleets that would make them the most powerful military force in the galaxy. War was over, but the galaxy had changed forever. Humanity had proven themselves and earned their place among the stars, but they had also shown what they were capable of when pushed to the edge. The other species would have to decide whether to embrace Earth as true equals or continue viewing them with fear. Thrace hoped they would choose wisely, because she had seen firsthand what happened when humans decided to fight, and she knew that the galaxy needed them as friends far more.